above these two windows, one which shows only the code and one which shows the code and the comments, we have a series of buttons here which are fairly self-explanatory. Send to the clipboard simply puts a copy of this code in the clipboard. If I go to a text editor and open it with the contents of the clipboard, now I can see that my code is here in my text editor. If I say text file on the desktop, I click on this, and this explains what happens. It's exported a method, which is this method, as a file, and there's the file with a date timestamp prefixed to it, and this file is sitting on the desktop. If I go look at the desktop, I can indeed find that file here sitting on the desktop. This might be useful if I was trying to transfer this method to another database or email it to a friend. Color code allows you to see the code colorized in a fashion which may make the structure easier to interpret. Here the indentation pattern is clearly documented, and this code can be easier to read and review. And if we wish, we can make a color code on the desktop. So we can see that we again have exported this method to the desktop. Now I tend to put things on the desktop that one needs access to immediately because it's an easy place to find. So we'll go here, look on the desktop. Here is that colorized method, and we can see it here on the desktop. Similarly, if one is interested simply in the pure code, one can put the text file on the desktop or send it to the clipboard. Here is a search box which we've used before, but this allows you to search for strings in the code. So if we're interested, for example, in the word date and see where it appears in the code or in the code and comments, you can type in date here. This gives you an indication of how frequently that occurs. There are 110 instances of the word date in this code, and in the pure code slightly less with 104 instances. If we use something a little less common like the string where, we can see that it occurs 7 times in the code and 7 times in the code with the comment, and we can find those instances scrolling down here. This is a splitter, and if you're interested only in the code, you can get it in a format where there's less text wrapping. Now in this location, there's a button which is labeled Compare Versions with a trailing number. And this says that there are, in fact, 24 versions of this method, this rs alpha date time method. And if we want to look at them, we can click on this button. What we're looking at here is simply the specific method that we saw on the listing here. This just happens to be the most recent version from any database. But let's go ahead and compare the versions. Now we're in a new window that shows the code from two different versions. This one's labeled version 23 and this is version 24. And again, there's a splitter that one can use to decide exactly how big each window will be. To navigate to look at other versions, one can click on these various buttons above the window. So if I'm looking now at version 23 and I want to look at version 22, I can hit the prior button, and now I'm looking at version 22. If I say next, I'll go back to version 23. Now next is grayed out. I can't go forward here because version 24 is over here on the right side. It's always the case that the more recent version is on the right. So if I want to click to an older version, let's go back to version 20. I'll now can see this is version 20 and this is version 24 of this same method. This is an indicator here which shows how similar the code is on these two versions. Here it's labeled 95% similar. If I go back in time, you can see that it becomes less similar. There's a rather abrupt change between version 16 and version 17, where presumably a major change in the code was made. Now, if I want to go back to version 23, I can just click on the word adjacent, and that refers to the right-hand listing here. So if I say adjacent, I will end up at 23, adjacent to the 24 over there. I go back in time here to the 16, and I go back here to the 20th. If I hit adjacent now, it'll end up at 19, adjacent to what we're seeing on the right side. You can never make the code on the left side refer to code more recent than what is being shown on the right side. Doing that in reverse, I can go back to the 10th version of the code here and click on the word adjacent over here, and that should go directly to the 11th version of the code. Looking at the 10th and the 11th, you can see that the similarity of the code is now 100%. This 100% figure refers only to the actual code. It would be possible for comments to be different between these two versions, but the code itself is identical. If I want to go back to the newest version, I can just click on this word newest, and I'm back here looking at the version 24. In these two windows, you are seeing the code with its comments. If you check this box here, you're reduced to looking only at the code itself. Unclick that, bring back the comments. If I do a search, I can also do a search similar here to what was seen elsewhere. If I look for the word problem, say go, you can see that it occurs in one location in both these versions of the code. There are 24 versions of this code if I look at any database. I can restrict that to a single database. This lists the 4 databases that actually have this code included in them. If I restrict this to the database begin, we're now down to only 11 versions of this code. Generally, I'll just go back up here to any database. Now we're back up to 24. I can colorize this code if I want. So let's say I'm interested in seeing the difference between version 23 and 24. Might be easier to see it as colorized code here. And now I'm comparing the code with the addition of color to help see the nature of the code. And you can see here actually that the description in version 23 and version 24 is different. This entire introductory comment is actually different than what we're looking at over here. The code itself is quite similar, but the comment has changed. Now we got to look at the various versions of a method by first clicking on a single instance of that method and then clicking on this button, Compare Versions. And that brought us into this window, which allowed us to look at the various versions of that particular piece of code. If one gets out here and goes to the View menu, you can see that there's a second menu item here called Version. And this, if you click on it, opens up a window which shows only methods that do have multiple versions. And this is a listing of all of the methods that have more than one version. This filtering bar here is similar to what we've seen earlier. We looked at the RS alpha project or method before, and we can go ahead here and click on it. And now immediately we're in this setting where we're comparing the versions of this particular method. So this tends to be used less, but if you have foreknowledge that what you're primarily interested in is comparing versions of a particular method, this is a way to directly go to this comparison window. I should go back and clarify a potential source of confusion, and that is when looking at multiple versions of the same piece of code. So we'll go back to the example that we've already looked at, this RS alpha date time method, and double click on that and go to this compare versions. You can see that there are 24 versions here, and before each version it tells you which database this particular version occurs in. And if you watch this as we go prior, here's several in the database begin. There's one in the database ArchiveMethod, etc. Now you can restrict the versions to a single database if you wish. But before we do that, I'll bring your attention here to the most recent version, and that is in the database called New Begin. If I go here and try and filter it to only the database New Begin, you can see that's not an option in the listing. The reason it's not an option is that in fact there is only one version of this database, of this code in the New Begin database. These databases that are listed here are the only ones that have multiple versions of this piece of code in them. So if I go to the database begin, I'll see that there are 11 versions of this database, of this piece of code in that particular database. If I go to the database command 4D, you can see that there are only 2 versions of this piece of code in that database.